The beans had been on the stove since noon. Harlan Cross had put them on that morning, the way he put them on every Wednesday. Dried pinto beans soaked overnight and simmered slow with a piece of salt pork and half an onion, the same way his wife Dorothy had made them for 31 years of their marriage, and the same way he had made them alone for the 2 years since she had passed. It was a Wednesday in November of 1973, cold enough that the kitchen window had been clouding with condensation since mid-morning, and the smell of the beans had been filling the farmhouse all afternoon in the way that slow-cooked beans filled a place, which was completely and without apology the way home was supposed to smell. He had known when he put the beans on that they were the last of what he had in the kitchen that was worth calling a meal. There was flour and lard and a little cornmeal and a few sweet potatoes that were going soft and half a jar of sorghum. After tonight he was going to have to drive to Ashboro and ask his daughter Miriam for help, which he had been not asking for going on 3 weeks now. Because asking Miriam for help meant admitting that the year had gone the way it had gone, and that 71 years old and alone on 60 acres in Randolph County, North Carolina was not the sustainable situation he had been telling himself it was. The tobacco had come in below grade in September. Not ruined, just low, and low tobacco in 1973, when input costs had gone the way they had gone, was enough to make the difference between a year that carried forward and a year that did not. The corn had been decent, but the corn price had not been what he needed it to be, and the combination of the two had left him. As November arrived and the fields were put to bed, in the specific position of a man who had worked hard all year and arrived at winter with less than he had started it with, he was not afraid. He had been in tight spots before, in the bad years of the late 1950s, when tobacco prices had been even worse, and he and Dorothy had stretched everything until it snapped, and had come through the other side because there was no other option, and because you did not give up on land that had belonged to your family since 1902. But he was tired in a way that the work alone did not account for. The specific tiredness of a man who had been managing everything alone for 2 years. The farming and the house and the accounts and the maintenance and the loneliness that was the largest of all the things he was managing, and the one he talked about least. He was stirring the beans at 5:30 when he heard something on the porch. The sound was not urgent. It was the sound of someone who was cold and uncertain about their reception, and was being careful not to startle anyone. The kind of knock that asked rather than demanded. Harlan set the wooden spoon on the pot rest and went to the door. The young man on the porch was about 28 years old, a black man with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a jacket that was not warm enough for the night that was coming on. He was not someone Harlan recognized from the county, and the county was not large enough that Harlan missed many faces. He looked like a man who had been walking for a while and who was trying to look less tired than he was. He said he was sorry to bother him and asked if he might use the telephone to call someone about his situation. He said his name was Henry Tillman. He said he was trying to get to Ashboro and had been walking from the highway since the bus he had been on had broken down outside of Ramseur, and the driver had said it would be 3 hours before another came. Harlan looked at him for a moment. Then he said the telephone was in the kitchen and he was welcome to come in. Henry had called a number in Ashboro and gotten no answer. He had set the phone back in its cradle and thanked Harlan and said he appreciated it and that he would get back to the highway and wait for the replacement bus. Harlan said it was 32 degrees out and dropping, and that the replacement bus might not come before dark. He said if Henry did not have a place to be, he was welcome to stay for supper and wait out the cold. Henry had looked at him with the specific, careful attention of a young man in 1973 in rural North Carolina, who had just been offered hospitality by a white farmer he had never met, and who was assessing, in the space of a second, what the offer was and what it was not, and whether accepting it was the thing to do. He had said thank you and come inside. They had eaten the beans and the cornbread at the kitchen table, the two of them, with the kitchen window still clouding, and the oil lamp on the table between them, because the bulb in the overhead fixture had gone out the previous week, and Harlan had not been to the hardware store. Henry had eaten with the careful manner of someone who had been hungry for a while, and who was not going to say so or show it more than the pace of his eating already told. Harlan had not said anything about the manner or the pace. He had passed the cornbread when Henry's piece was gone, and had refilled Henry's bowl without asking, and had done both of these things in the way you did them when you were in the habit of feeding people properly. They had talked. Not about the hardness of either of their situations, because there was an unspoken agreement at that table that the situations were what they were, and that talking about them was not what was needed. They talked about the farm and what Harlan grew and how the tobacco worked, and what November felt like on 60 acres when the work was done and the ground was quiet. Henry had asked questions that were genuine rather than polite, and Harlan had answered them the same way, because after 31 years of marriage to a woman who asked genuine questions, he knew the difference. Henry told Harlan he had come back from the army in September. He said he had been in for 6 years, the last 2 in Germany, rather than anywhere more difficult, and that he was going home to his mother's house in Ashborough to figure out what came next. He said he had some money saved and some ideas, and that the ideas were more concrete than most people expected from a man whose ideas were still mostly in his head, but that he had learned in the army that planning was how you got from one place to another, and that he had been planning. Harlan had asked what kind of ideas. Henry had said construction. He said he had spent 2 years in Germany working with a construction battalion, doing base maintenance and infrastructure repair, and had learned more about building than he had expected to learn, and had found that he was good at it, and that being good at something you had not known you were going to be good at was a particular kind of information about yourself that was worth taking seriously. Harlan had said that sounded right. He had said that the thing about finding what you were good at was that it found you as much as you found it, and that a man who paid attention to what the work was telling him was always ahead of the man who told the work what it was supposed to tell him. Henry had looked at him when he said that. He had said that was a useful way to put it. They had sat at the table for a while after the meal with coffee that was mostly chicory, because Harlan had been stretching the coffee since October, and the conversation had moved the way kitchen conversations moved late in the evening, across different things without a particular direction. And it had been a good conversation in the way that conversations were good when neither party needed anything from the other except the conversation. Henry had said he would sleep on the porch or in the barn if Harlan had a spare blanket, that he didn't want to put him out. Harlan had said the spare bedroom was made up, and that he wasn't going to put a man outside in November when there was a bedroom with a bed in it, and that the subject was closed. In the morning, Henry had been up before Harlan, which Harlan had not expected, and had brought in the wood from the porch woodpile and stacked it beside the stove, and had fed the chickens from the grain bin, after figuring out on his own where the grain was kept. He had been doing this when Harlan came downstairs and had said good morning and asked if Harlan wanted him to check on anything else before he left. Harlan had made them both coffee and oatmeal, and they had eaten breakfast, and then Henry had taken his duffel bag from the spare room and had shaken Harlan's hand at the door. He had reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and had taken out a small piece of paper on which he had written a phone number and the name and address of his mother's house in Ashborough, and had given it to Harlan. He had said if Harlan ever came through Ashborough or ever needed anything, to call. Harlan had put the paper in his shirt pocket and said he appreciated the company, and that he hoped the construction business worked out the way Henry expected it to. Henry had said he thought it would. He had walked down the farm lane toward the county road in the cold November morning without looking back, and Harlan had watched him go from the porch and had then gone back inside and washed the breakfast dishes and gotten his coat and driven to Ashborough to ask Miriam for help. He had kept the piece of paper. He had put it in the cigar box in the bureau drawer where he kept the things that were worth keeping, the small documents and photographs and folded notes that accumulated across a life, and that represented nothing systematic, but that were too specific to discard. It sat there alongside a photograph of Dorothy from 1941, and his discharge papers from the Second World War, and the deed to the 60 acres that his father had signed over to him. in 1955. He had not called the number. Not because the gesture had not been genuine, because calling it would have required something Harlan Cross did not find easy, which was asking for help from someone he had fed on the night he had nothing left to feed anyone with, and which felt to him like the wrong direction for the debt to run. 18 years passed. Harlan farmed the 60 acres through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the tobacco years and the years when tobacco began its long, slow departure from the Piedmont farms, and he had shifted the ground over to hay and a small beef cattle operation that suited the ground well enough and suited him well enough, and that he had managed with a combination of stubbornness and practical adjustment that had gotten him through every transition the farm had required since he had taken it over in 1955. He had a stroke in the spring of 1991. Not a severe one, but enough to leave him with a left-hand weakness that made some of the farm work impractical without help, and that made the 60 acres, for the first time in his adult life, feel larger than he could manage alone. Miriam had come and had stayed for 3 weeks, and had managed the transition to a leased arrangement with a neighbor who would work the hay ground for a share of the proceeds. And during those 3 weeks, she had also gone through the farmhouse systematically with the specific efficiency of a daughter who had been watching her father accumulate things for 40 years, and who understood that at 89, the systems needed organizing. She had found the cigar box. She had gone through it item by item, setting aside the things that needed to be kept in a better place, and asking Harlan about the items she did not recognize. She had held up the piece of paper with the phone number and the Ashboro address, and had asked Harlan who Henry Tillman was. Harlan had told her. He had told her about the November evening in 1973, the beans and the cornbread and the cold, the young man on the porch with the duffel bag and the not warm enough jacket. He had told her about the breakfast and the wood and the chickens and the piece of paper given at the door. Miriam had listened to all of it. Then she had asked if she could try the number. Harlan had said the number was 18 years old and was his mother's house, and that his mother was probably not still living, and that the whole thing was likely outdated. Miriam had tried it anyway. The number rang 4 times and was answered by a woman who said that her name was Tillman and that her son Henry was not in, but that she would take a message. She was 91 years old and still living in the house in Ashboro. She took Miriam's name and the farm's number and said she would pass it along. Henry Tillman called back 2 days later. He was 46 years old. He had been running Tillman Construction out of Ashboro since 1977, 14 years, and had grown it from a 2-man residential repair operation into a commercial construction firm with 23 employees that had built or renovated several commercial properties in Randolph County and the surrounding area. He was on the county Small Business Development Board and had a reputation in the Ashboro construction industry that was, by all accounts, built on the same qualities he had described at a kitchen table in 1973, which was that he was good at the work and took seriously what the work told him about itself. He remembered the farm. He remembered the evening in exact and specific terms, the way people remembered evenings that had mattered. He remembered the beans and the chicory coffee and the oil lamp and the conversation about finding what you were good at. He remembered leaving in the morning and giving Harlan the piece of paper and walking down the farm lane and thinking, as he walked, that he had just had one of the better meals and one of the better conversations of the previous 2 years, which had been difficult years in ways he had not said at the kitchen table, and which the meal and the conversation had, in some specific way he would not have been able to fully articulate, helped him through. He asked about Harlan. Miriam told him about the stroke and the current situation. Henry listened and asked several practical questions about the farm's legal and financial status with the specific directness of a man who was sizing up a problem he intended to address. He came to the farm the following week. He drove up the farm lane in a company truck with the Tillman Construction logo on the door, and he knocked on the farmhouse door, and Harlan answered it, and they looked at each other for a moment. The 89-year-old farmer and the 46-year-old contractor, and Henry said, "Mr. Cross, it is good to see you." Harlan said it was good to see him too. He said he looked like the construction business had worked out. Henry had said it had. He said he wanted to talk about the farm and whether there was anything Harlan needed help thinking through. They had talked for 3 hours at the kitchen table, the same table, in the same kitchen, with the same window, although the overhead bulb had long since been replaced. Henry had reviewed the lease arrangement with the neighbor and had said it was fair. He had looked at the farm's basic financial situation, as Miriam had summarized it, and had said that the operation was viable if the hay lease held, and that the debt load from a tractor purchase in 1988 was manageable on the current income, but would become a problem if the hay lease fell through for any reason, and that it might be worth thinking about what the backup plan was. Harlan had said he had been thinking about exactly that. Henry said the construction business had given him some resources, and that he was not saying this to make a transaction of an old debt that was not a debt, but that if Harlan ever found himself in a position where the farm needed something he did not have, to call. He said the meal in 1973 had been the kind of thing that a person did not forget, and that he had not forgotten it, and that he had thought about it more times than Harlan would expect across the 18 years between that November and this one. Harlan had been quiet for a moment. He said he had put the piece of paper in the cigar box because he had intended to call if he ever had a reason to. He said the stroke had finally given him the reason, though he had needed Miriam to see it. Henry had said that was all right. He said sometimes, you needed a Miriam. Harlan had laughed at that. It was the first time he had laughed in several weeks, and it was the kind of laugh that came from recognition rather than comedy. The recognition of something true said in the right way, at the right time. They had eaten dinner that evening, the two of them, at the same table where they had eaten the beans and the cornbread in 1973. Miriam had made the meal this time, pork chops and biscuits and green beans from the last of the canning, and Henry had eaten with the ease of a man who was at home in the specific kind of kitchen he was sitting in, which was the kind that had always had food in it and people who were willing to share it. Harlan Cross had not lost the farm. The hay lease had held through 1994 when his health made the continued management impractical, and Miriam had arranged a sale to the neighbor who had been leasing it. A fair sale at the right price, with none of the complications that unresolved debts and unclear arrangements produced. Henry Tillman had not been involved in the transaction financially, though he had been available by phone when Miriam had questions about the process, because by then, the relationship between the Cross family and Henry Tillman was not a transaction. It was the kind of relationship that grew from a specific evening in November of 1973, when a man who had very little had given what he had to, someone who needed it without asking what would come back. What came back was Henry Tillman at the door 18 years later, and what Henry had brought back was not payment for beans and cornbread, because there was no payment for beans and cornbread. He had brought back the specific quality of attention and care that Harlan had given him on a cold November night, returned in a different form in a different season, but recognizably the same thing, the same quality, the same willingness to give what was needed without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Harlan Cross passed in 1997 at 95 years old, in the house on the 60 acres he had farmed since 1955. Henry Tillman had been to see him twice in the last year of his life, driving down from Ashboro on Saturdays, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and talking about the things that men talked about at the end of a long life, which were the same things they talked about at the beginning of one, only with more evidence to support the conclusions. Miriam had called Henry the morning after her father passed. He had come to the house that day and had sat with the family for the afternoon, and Miriam had told him later, in a letter she had written and that Henry had kept, that his presence that day had meant more to her family than she had words for, because it was the presence of someone who had known her father as the man he had been in the middle of his life, at the kitchen table, in the oil lamplight, with beans and chicory coffee between them on a cold night in 1973. She had said her father had told her, in the last weeks of his life, that the night Henry Tillman had come to his door was one of the nights he was most glad he had answered it. She said Harlan had said that you never knew what you were opening the door to when you opened it, and that the only way to find out was to open it. Henry had read that letter many times in the years since. He kept it in the same place Harlan had kept his piece of paper, which was in a box of the things that were worth keeping. The 60 acres that Harlan Cross had farmed had been in his family since his grandfather, a man named Luther Cross, had bought them from a timber company in 1902 for $45 and a promissory note that had taken 6 years to pay off. Luther had been a tobacco farmer his entire working life and had passed the practice to his son Raymond, and Raymond had passed it to Harlan, and Harlan had understood from the time he was old enough to understand anything about the farm that the 60 acres were not just property. They were the specific form that the family's work had taken across 3 generations, and the form was worth preserving not because it was sacred, but because it was real. And real things that were worth preserving deserved the effort of their preservation. Dorothy had understood this the same way Harlan understood it, which was to say, completely and without needing to discuss it very often. She had married Harlan in 1940 and had moved into the farmhouse and had managed the household and helped with the tobacco curing and raised 3 children and kept the accounts in the specific way that women of her generation and her character did things, with the full application of every competence they had, and without the expectation that this would be particularly noticed. The 2 years between Dorothy's passing and the November evening when Henry Tillman knocked on the door had been the 2 hardest years of a life that had contained some genuinely hard years. Not because the work had gotten harder, but because the work was the same and the house was different, and the difference was what was hard. He had not told Henry any of this at the kitchen table in 1973. It was not the kind of thing you told a stranger who had knocked on your door in the cold. But Henry's arrival had interrupted something that evening, and the something it had interrupted was useful to have interrupted, because having someone else at the table made the kitchen feel less like a place where a man sat alone with his problems, and more like a place where people ate together and talked, and the problems were still there, but did not occupy the whole of the room. Henry had known some of this, in the way that people who have been given specific kindness in a specific difficult moment understood something about what the kindness had cost, even when the cost was not stated. He had thought about that kitchen and that meal and that conversation many times across the 18 years between November of 1973 and the spring of 1991. Not daily, but in the specific way that certain evenings returned to you across time as reference points, locations in your personal geography that you used to find yourself when other locations were unclear. The quality of attention was the thing he had carried forward most from the evening. The specific quality of being listened to by someone who was genuinely interested in what you were saying, and who asked questions from that interest rather than from politeness. He had tried to bring that quality to his own work, to the employees he had hired and trained, to the clients who were often people trying to build something they had saved for and who needed to know that the person managing the work understood what it meant to them, to the county small business board work that had taken up more of his time as the years went on. He had not been fully conscious of the connection while making it. He was conscious of it in retrospect. Miriam had asked him once, on one of the Saturday visits to the farm in the last year of Harlan's life, what he remembered most clearly about the evening in 1973. Henry had said he remembered the oil lamp and the way its light had made the kitchen feel like its own separate world from the cold outside. He had said he remembered that Harlan had refilled his bowl without asking and had passed the cornbread without comment, and that these 2 gestures, small and unremarkable to someone who did not know the context, had communicated something about the evening that no words had been needed to say. He had said he remembered walking down the farm lane the next morning, thinking that whatever came next for him, this was the standard of how to treat people when they needed something, and you had something to give. He had said it had been a useful standard to carry. Miriam had said her father would be glad to know that. Henry had said he thought Harlan already knew it. He said the kind of man who gave the meal to begin with was the kind of man who understood what it meant to be given it. The tobacco years in Randolph County had not been easy for anyone farming the Piedmont during the 1970s. Harlan had watched neighbors sell out across the decade, families who had farmed in the county since before his grandfather bought the 60 acres, and he had understood each departure as evidence not of failure, but of calculation. He had run his own numbers every year and arrived each year at the conclusion that the farm was viable if nothing went wrong, and fragile if something did, and that the right response was to reduce the things that could go wrong to the smallest possible set through management. He had converted the tobacco ground to hay in stages as the tobacco economics deteriorated, a transition that had worked better than he expected, partly because the neighbor across the road had a beef cattle operation and was a willing buyer for the hay at prices that were consistent, and consistency was worth more than spectacular in Harlan's understanding of farming. Henry had come to the farm in 1991 with nothing specific to offer and with no plan beyond sitting at the kitchen table and listening. The construction business had given him resources, and the resources were available if they were useful, and he was not going to make a ceremony of the offer or attach conditions to it, or require anything from the offering except that it be received in the spirit it was given, which was the same spirit in which the beans had been given in 1973. That was the only continuity that mattered. Henry came to Harlan's funeral in October of 1997 and stood in the small Methodist church in the county and listened to the service and shook hands with Miriam's children and grandchildren and drove back to Asheboro on the county road in the October light, with the knowledge of a man who had carried something given to him for 24 years and who was now carrying it forward alone, without the person who had given it still living to receive the news of what it had become. He had decided by the time he pulled into the Asheboro yard that you kept doing what the giving had made possible, because that was how the giving continued, and because there was no other way to honor it. That was as useful as that. He made a note the following Monday about a young man who had come to him looking for work, a recent Army veteran with construction experience and no local connections, and a quality about him that Henry had noticed, and that reminded him of something he could not immediately place. He wrote the note in the margin of his calendar for the following week. Interview Marcus Webb. Ask about the work. He thought he knew what he was opening the door to. He opened it. The oil lamp that had been on the kitchen table that November evening in 1973 was on the mantelpiece in Miriam's house in Asheboro by the time Harlan passed. She had brought it from the farmhouse when she cleared it after the sale, not because it was particularly valuable, but because it was the specific object around which the story of her father and Henry Tillman was organized in her memory, the light source of an evening that had mattered in ways neither participant had fully understood until long after it was over. Henry had asked about it on one of his last visits to the farm, had asked if that was the same lamp. Miriam had said yes. He had looked at it for a while and had not said anything more. She had written him a letter after her father passed that Henry kept in a box of the things worth keeping, alongside the telephone number Harlan had never used. She had written that her father had said in the last weeks of his life that the night Henry Tillman had come to his door was one of the nights he was most glad he had answered it. She said Harlan had said you never knew what you were opening the door to when you opened it, and that the only way to find out was to open it. The letter was still in the box. Henry had read it many times across the years since. Not in the way you read something to extract meaning from it, but in the way you return to something that confirmed what you already believed. The way you return to a reference point to check your location. The 60 acres in Randolph County had been sold in 1994. The sale handled cleanly at the right price, with none of the complications that could have made it otherwise. Miriam's family had received what was fair for what had been built there across 92 years, from Luther Cross and his $45 promissory note in 1902 to Harlan Cross and his 41 years of farming it alone, and together and then alone again. The new owner was the neighbor who had been buying the hay for 20 years and who knew the ground and intended to farm it, which was the right outcome for land that had been farmed across 4 generations. Harlan had known this and had been at peace with it in the specific way that a man was at peace with the end of something, when the end was appropriate to what the thing had been. He had said to Miriam that the land was going to someone who would farm it, and that a farm that was farmed was what a farm was for, and that he had done what he could do with it for as long as he could do it, and that was the whole of what was required of him. He had been right. That was the whole of what was required. Henry Tillman's construction business had continued to grow through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, expanding into commercial renovation work across the Piedmont region, the kind of work that required the same qualities he had identified in himself in 2 years of Army construction, and that he had been developing and applying for nearly 3 decades by the time the business was large enough that other people were writing about it in the Asheboro Business Journal and the Randolph County Chamber of Commerce newsletters. He did not read those accounts with particular interest because they were accounts of a business, and the business was what it was because of the work, and the work was what it was because of the qualities. And the qualities were what they were because of a sequence of things that had begun long before anyone was writing about the business, in a specific evening in a specific farmhouse on 60 acres of Piedmont ground. He kept thinking about that farmhouse, that kitchen, that table, that lamp, not because he needed to return to it for any purpose, because it was one of the locations in his personal geography that he used to find himself when other locations were unclear, and he was old enough now to understand that this function was the most important thing a memory could serve. Not nostalgia and not obligation, but orientation. The kind of orientation that came from knowing where you had been and what had been given to you when you needed it. He had tried to give what was needed to the people who needed it when he had something to give. He had not always succeeded, but he had always tried. And the trying had been shaped from its beginning by a man named Harlan Cross, who had refilled his bowl without asking, and had passed the cornbread without comment, and had made a bedroom with a bed available to a stranger in November, and had sent him down the farm lane the next morning with directions and a sack lunch and a piece of paper with a phone number that had sat in a cigar box for 18 years before it was used. The debt was not a debt. That was the thing he had understood from the beginning, and had continued to understand more clearly as the years had passed. The meal had not been a loan. It had been a gift, the specific kind of gift that asked nothing in return. And that was worth more, because it asked nothing. You did not repay a gift like that. You carried it forward in the way you treated the next person who needed something and came to your door in the cold. Marcus Webb had come to Tillman Construction in 1997, the fall of the year Harlan passed. A young man in his late 20s with 2 years of Army construction experience and the quiet, careful manner of someone who had been through something difficult and had come out the other side with a specific quality of attention that was different from the attention of a man who had not been through anything difficult. Henry had hired him on the same basis that any man hired another man who had what was needed, which was that the work would show what the work showed, and that the rest would follow from that. The work had shown what it showed. 25 years later, Marcus Webb was the operations manager of Tillman Construction and had been for 18 years, and the relationship between him and Henry was the kind of relationship that grew from a specific morning when someone opened a door and asked the right question and listened to the answer, which was the same morning, and the same question, and the same listening that had been going on in that company since its beginning, shaped from its beginning by a man who had learned it at a kitchen table on a November evening, when someone who had very little had given what he had, without asking what would come back. What had come back was more than one meal's worth of giving. It always was. Henry Tillman sat at his own kitchen table on a November morning in 2022, 49 years after the evening on Harlan's farm, and drank his coffee in the particular quiet of a morning that reminded him of that other morning. The cold and the stillness and the specific quality of light that November had in the Piedmont, when the sky was gray and the trees were bare, and the world was stripped down to its essentials. He thought about Harlan. He thought about the lamp and the beans and the cornbread and the conversation and the piece of paper given at the door. He thought about the fact that 49 years had passed, and that the sequence of things set in motion by that evening was still going on, in the work and the company and the people in it, and the way they did what they did, and that this was the way things worked when they were given correctly, which was that they kept going long past the evening that started them. He finished his coffee and went to work. The door was always going to be opened. He had learned that a long time ago from a man who had taught it by opening his own. Miriam had kept the oil lamp after her father passed, and had kept it on the mantelpiece and had told the story of the November evening to her own children and her grandchildren with the consistency of someone who understood that the story was the kind of story that was worth keeping in circulation. Not as a moral lesson, and not as family mythology, but as a piece of specific family history that described what kind of person their grandfather had been, and what kind of world a person like that helped build simply by being what they were in the moments when what they were was needed. The youngest of her grandchildren, a girl named Dorothy, after her great-grandmother, had asked once why the farmer had shared his last meal with a stranger. Miriam had thought about how to answer that in a way that was true rather than sentimental. She had said because that was what her grandfather did. She said he had been a man who understood that what you had was not entirely yours, that it was partly yours because of the work you had done, and partly yours because of the luck of being born where you were born, and partly yours because of the people who had come before you and done their own work, so that you had something to inherit and build on. She said a man who understood that did not close his door when someone was cold and hungry on the other side of it. He opened it and shared what he had because the sharing was part of what the having was for. Dorothy had listened to this and had thought about it, in the quiet way that children thought about things they were not sure they fully understood, but that they recognized as worth holding. She had looked at the oil lamp on the mantelpiece and had asked if the stranger had ever come back. Miriam had smiled and had said yes. She said he had come back with a truck and a whole company and a life that her father had been part of in a small way at the right time. She said that was what happened when you gave things correctly, which was that they came back to you in forms you had not anticipated and could not have planned for, because what you gave when you gave it freely was not a transaction but a beginning, and beginnings had their own direction from there. Dorothy had thought about that for a while. Then she had asked if she could hold the lamp. Miriam had handed it to her. Dorothy had held it carefully, the way children held things they understood to be significant, and had looked at it in the November afternoon light that came through the window, and had set it back on the mantelpiece. She had not said anything else about it, but she had remembered it. That was how these things continued.